update to the Catechism. Pope Francis calls the death penalty inadmissible. We have a report from Rome and analysis. Tribute to the fallen. Vice President Pence greets the remains of U.S. soldiers killed in the Korean War. Focus on peace. Latin American countries examine growing violence in Nicaragua. And a very hot topic. The city of Rome does its best to battle soaring temperatures. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, August 2nd, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis makes a revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church on the issue of the death penalty. The Vatican says the Holy Father is going back to Pope John Paul II's call for the abolition of capital punishment. Previously, the Catechism said the Church didn't exclude the use of the death penalty if, quote, this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. Now, it says, the Church teaches that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, what explanation is the Vatican giving for this update?
Cardinal Luis Ladaria, who is the head of the Vatican's Doctrine Office, Lauren, explains that there is an increasing understanding today that the dignity of a person is not lost even after they've committed the most serious crimes. Now, he says this revision follows the teachings of Pope St. John Paul II, who had affirmed that ending the life of a criminal as punishment for a crime is simply inadmissible. St. John Paul II said, quote, not even a murderer loses his personal dignity, and God himself pledges to guarantee this. Now, he wrote that in his famous encyclical, The Gospel of Life, back in 1995.
Juliet, what has prompted Pope Francis to make these revisions?
Lauren, Pope Francis has spoken out against the death penalty throughout his 5-year pontificate. The Holy Father forecast this revision of the Catechism when he celebrated its 25th anniversary last October. The pontiff said the death penalty violates the gospel and amounts to the voluntary killing of a human life, which, quote, is always sacred in the eyes of the Creator. Now, today the Vatican is stressing the continuity with the Holy Father's immediate predecessors. In 1997, Pope St. John Paul II also revised the text of the Catechism to reflect his encyclical, The Gospel of Life. And that revision, Lauren, said that the use of the death penalty should be very rare, if not practically non-existent. While Benedict XVI, for his part, also recalled the need to make every effort to eliminate the death penalty. Now, this latest revision to the Catechism will be included in all the editions going forward.
Juliet, I worked for the Archdiocese here in Washington when Pope Francis came here in 2015. I remember his address to Congress where he called for the abolition of the death penalty. He seemed to be telegraphing this change to the Catechism.
That's right, Lauren. In that historic address, Francis called for the end of the death penalty, and here is what he had to say to Congress.
I am convinced that this way is the best, since every life is sacred. Every human person is endowed with unalienable dignity, and society can only benefit from the rehabilitation of those convicted of crimes.
Now, on nearly every foreign trip, Francis has visited prisoners to offer words of solidarity and hope, and he actually still stays in touch with a group of Argentine inmates that he ministered to during his years as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Lauren.
Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly, Vatican correspondent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ed Morrissey, host of The Ed Morrissey Show, joins us via Skype from Minneapolis. Ed, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Lauren. Great to be here.
You've been talking to lay Catholics. Tell me what the predominant reaction is.
I think that there's a surprise that this change has taken place. Maybe not as the fact that the Catholic Church opposes the death penalty, I think people already understand that, especially here in the U.S., where the bishops have been very outspoken about this. But I think the fact that they're changing the catechism to completely preclude any support whatsoever for the death penalty is going to have some Catholics here in the United States feeling a little bit lost, I believe.
What you said in a piece you wrote this morning for Hot Air was that these Catholics will find themselves having been separated from the church without having moved at all a position of injustice. Why do you say that?
I've talked with Catholics who have been very thoughtful about their support of the death penalty. I don't share that support. I actually follow I believe in what the bishops have been teaching about the seamless garment of life. I've stuck to that for a number of years, but I do respect the fact that people are going to Scripture and finding scriptural support for the position of supporting the death penalty, and the teaching of the Catholic Church up until this moment in time allowed them to have that sort of prudential judgment on this policy. And now that prudential judgment, or at least the room for that prudential judgment, has been taken away, even though it had been extremely narrowed over the last 50, 60 years anyway. I think that what's going to be called into question here is, how do you implement this without making people feel as though they've just suddenly become transformed into sinners, while they've been very thoughtful and faithful Catholics all along?
That leads to my next question. What do bishops need to say to their flock about this? Does it need clarification?
I think what needs to be clarified is where people stand in relation to the church if they support the death penalty. I mean, there's certainly a number of points in the catechism that people sometimes will have some struggles with, that they don't fully align with, and that they understand that this is where the Catholic Church is at, and I have to somehow find myself in a position where I can at least be in some sort of concert with that. The bishops are going to have to give us a pathway for that, or give these people a pathway for that, so that they don't feel like they've been let go.
Before we let you go, Greg Burke, Vatican spokesman, said, "It is a message to all Catholics. Let's go back to what it means to respect life at all time and in all cases." Do you think people will be swayed by that argument?
I think that the argument that Bishop Laderia made, Cardinal Laderia made, is going to be the right path. It's to argue that, look, we've been narrowing this down to the point where, for all practical purposes, the Catholic Church has already been opposed to the death penalty for many, many years. And all we're saying is that we need to recognize the reality that we can do other things besides execute people in order to protect the innocent. And I think that argument, it's going to take a while, but I think that argument will eventually win out.
Ed Morrissey, host of Hot Air's The Ed Morrissey Show, airing most Tuesdays and Thursdays from 4 to 5:30 Eastern. Ed, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
Joining me now is Father Thomas Petri, a theologian and dean of the Dominican House of Studies. Father Petri, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Are faithful Catholics now obligated to oppose the death penalty? We just heard Ed Morrissey say there's no room for prudential judgment here. Is that accurate?
I disagree with Ed on that point. The Church's teaching hasn't changed. As we heard earlier, this is the second time the Catechism has been revised on this paragraph. The first was in 1997. And what was interesting about that revision under St. John Paul II was that a prudential pastoral teaching was put into a catechism. We're used to going to the catechism for doctrines and dogmas. This is pastoral and prudential, and Pope Francis's new pastoral and prudential approach is in continuity with what John Paul did.
Today's headlines, the Associated Press, many religious publications all say the Church is changing her teachings, which is the point you just made, that it is not. You say it's not accurate. Why is this nuance not understood by media?
Well, because, this is the headline, that the Pope has changed the catechism. It's the teaching of the Church, people say. But the Church's teaching on what punishment is and how the states have a right to inflict punishment commensurate to the gravity of the crime does not change, and that's still in the catechism. But there's always been a suggestion that Christians should be reticent, even going back to the Church Fathers, reticent and reluctant themselves to even participate in the death penalty.
What about people who say abolishing the death penalty isn't practical in many parts of the world? They don't have sophisticated systems. Their judicial system and actually their penal system is different.
Well, when you read the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, they issued a sort of accompanying note with this change, and they pointed to the notion of movement, how this change is hoping to inspire movement in the church and in Catholics to help advocate for those conditions that are necessary where the death penalty could be abolished, but understandably, prudentially, there are some places in the world where it cannot be.
But what about the traditional idea of justice and retribution?
That's right. So the traditional idea is that by punishing a criminal, they are contributing back to the common good what they've taken from it. And some crimes are so grave that they require the penalty of their life, the death penalty. But the Holy Father is turning to the gospel and to another doctrine, which is the doctrine of mercy and patience. So I would say this is about relating two different doctrines together in a prudential application.
Again, I want to ask you one more time. Are faithful Catholics now obligated to oppose the death penalty?
I think they're obligated to take what the Holy Father says and use that to form their conscience. But in their conscience, they must follow what they understand to be the Church's teaching. And the Church's teaching has always allowed and seen the permissibility of the death penalty. However, in the current context, in today's world, it seems that its use is not necessary.
Okay. Father Thomas Petri, theologian, Dean of the Dominican House of Studies, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
U.S. elections remain under constant threat from foreign governments like Russia. That's the message today from President Trump's national security team. Homeland Security Chief Kirstjen Nielsen describes it this way: our democracy is in the crosshairs. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. This ominous warning comes just months before the November midterm elections. National Intelligence Director Dan Coats also appeared at today's White House press briefing. He warns of a pervasive messaging campaign by Russia to divide the United States, although he says it's not as bad as last time.
We know that through decades, Russia has tried to use its propaganda and methods to sow discord in America. However, they stepped up their game big time in 2016. We have not seen that kind of robust effort from them so far.
Coates says we're only one keyboard click away from more cyber attacks. And he says the attacks from Russia are on both political parties. FBI Director Chris Wray adds the threat is not going away.
Our adversaries are trying to undermine our country on a persistent and regular basis, whether it's election season or not.
Wray says the U.S. government is working to protect the integrity of our electoral process. Even the Defense Department is involved, although a military representative would not say if America has launched counterattacks. Congress is also proposing action ahead of the midterms. The Senate is working on a bipartisan bill backed by GOP leaders that would boost security, giving federal assistance to state and local election officials. It's expected in September. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons, thank you. In a somber ceremony, Vice President Mike Pence is on hand to receive the remains of 55 soldiers killed in the Korean War.
Some have called the Korean War the forgotten war. But today, we prove these heroes were never forgotten. Today, our boys are coming home.
The delegation greeted the coffins at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The soldiers are believed to be American and from other United Nations members who fought alongside the U.S. Diplomats from across the Americas are calling on Nicaragua's president to stop the violent crackdown. Hundreds have died since April. Representatives from Latin America are meeting here in Washington to figure out next steps. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby has been following the developments at the Organization of American States. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. This group, the OAS, is dedicated to promoting democracy, human rights, security, and development across the Americas. To that end, diplomats here have had several concrete options they've been thinking about when it comes to Nicaragua. They could freeze assets and loans for President Daniel Ortega and other high-ranking officials. They could also send a commission to the country in order to investigate what's been going on. Advocates are voicing their support for the Nicaraguan people, and they say the Catholic Church is trying to help.
Our bishops, they're doing the role to protect the people. I mean, whenever somebody's being killed, an innocent people has been killed, and they don't have any weapons to defend themselves, so the Catholic Church has been proactive in trying to protect the people's right and also the people's life.
Alfonso Talavera, a native of Nicaragua who now lives in Washington, says the Organization of American States needs to put more pressure on the Ortega government. Many here at the OAS believe a diplomatic solution is possible, but critics say the only real solution is a new government without Daniel Ortega. Thousands of Nicaraguans are fleeing their country for other countries like Costa Rica. At least 300 people have died since anti-government unrest in Nicaragua began in April, and some human rights groups say the death toll is closer to 400. Lauren?
Correspondent White Goolsby reporting from the Organization of American States. Thank you. Zimbabwe's president and opposition leader both claim victory in the country's presidential election. Results have been delayed following violence between soldiers and opposition party supporters. The fighting left 6 dead. Officials say they will announce the winners tonight. It is the first election since longtime President Robert Mugabe stepped down last year under pressure. The Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt says it will not accept new monks in its monasteries for 1 year. The news comes days after a bishop was killed inside one northwest of Cairo. The church also gives monks 1 month to shut down their social media accounts, saying they are, quote, inappropriate for monastic life. Rescuers from Spain save 87 migrants in a dramatic nighttime operation near Libya.
Don't swim! Don't swim! Stay to the life jacket.
Okay.
Be calm.
The group included 8 miners. Once on board, they begged not to be returned to Libya, indicating they have been beaten and have not been given food or water. It is not clear which European country will grant the ship a safe port. Coming up, the leader of the Archdiocese of Washington reflects on the resignation of former Cardinal McCarrick. Plus, an advocate for religious freedom updates us on the case of an American pastor jailed in Turkey. Turkey accuses President Trump of jeopardizing long-standing ties between Turkey and the U.S. and threatens retaliation. The country is calling on the U.S. to reverse its decision to sanction 2 Turkish government ministers over detained American pastor Andrew Brunson. Brunson, an evangelical pastor, was arrested in December 2016. He was jailed on espionage and terror-related charges until being placed on house arrest last month. The pastor faces a prison sentence of up to 35 years if he is convicted. Joining me now is Cristina Arriaga, Vice Chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
I interviewed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who told me that the State Department every single day is working on his release. We have sanctions. He's on house arrest. What's going to happen next?
The situation right now is worse than ever. The fact that Pastor Andrew Brunson is in an apartment in Izmir and the Turkish government, which controls all the press, is inciting violence. It's a terrible situation for them.
What do you mean they're inciting violence over
Well,
this?
the government of Turkey in the last 2 years, Erdogan has gotten rid of all free press. There is no social media unless it's controlled by the government. There's no television. And there are these fantastical stories about this priest spy. And just yesterday, the foreign minister said, Turkey's not going to bend the knee before this priest spy. And unfortunately, Erdogan has a lot of supporters in the area.
You were in the courtroom 2 weeks ago, July 18th, when Pastor Brunson was there. He had the hearing. You were one of the first people outside of the family and legal counsel to visit him in Turkey in prison in 2017. Tell us about him and how he's being treated and his emotional state.
Well, I saw him a year ago. He had lost 50 pounds. He looks emaciated. His wife, who's already very slender, has also lost 30 pounds. He's obviously not well, and he cannot see very well. And he is way up front, like in a basketball court that they have made into a courtroom. His wife is way out back. So whenever he looks back, she stands up and puts her hand over her heart. The trial, the hearing was extremely disturbing. The judges were feeding information to the witnesses for the prosecution. There was no evidence.
The judges.
The judges. The
judges were feeding information to the witnesses.
And these witnesses were supposedly Pastor Brunson's friends, and they testified for 2 hours against him, full of lies, could not come up with any evidence. And at the end of it, at the end of 2 hours, the judge says to Andrew Brunson, "What do you have to say for yourself?" And he says, "My faith teaches me to forgive. I forgive all of those who just testified against me." And the judge went ballistic. We're not here to talk about faith. We're not here to talk about religion. We're here to talk about the case.
So, based on everything you have said right now, is he going to get a fair trial?
Of course he's not going to get a fair trial. It was a kangaroo court. All of the witnesses for the government are secret witnesses. All of the witnesses that have testified so far are witnesses for the prosecution.
So what is it going to take to change this situation?
The only way to save him right now is to get him out of the country, and that is what President Trump and the Vice President are insisting on. I mean, Pastor Brunson was held for 18 months without being charged, without knowing what he was charged for, and the government of Turkey, before they gave the indictment to his own attorney, leaked it to the press.
Cristina Arriaga, Vice Chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, thank you for joining us. Thank you for updating on this case.
Thank you.
Cardinal Donald Wuerl of Washington says he has met with the priests from his archdiocese following the resignation of now Archbishop Theodore McCarrick after claims of sexual abuse. In an interview with the Catholic Standard newspaper, the cardinal says, quote, "Priests in particular feel the pain of the failure of a brother priest. One way to at least begin the process is to actually speak about it frankly. And that was what we did in our meeting." He adds he also met with the diocese seminarians. Wuerl applauds the bravery of the victims who have come forward. The Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania has named 71 priests and other church members accused of child sexual abuse. Bishop Ronald Gaynor says he is holding accountable the bishops of the past 70 years and is removing their names from all diocese properties. Up next, a Lutheran cathedral in Sweden has heightened its security after a heist. And if you can't stand the heat, stay out of this European city. A Lutheran cathedral housing Sweden's crown jewels has reopened after robbers stole priceless artifacts. The thieves took 2 crowns and an orb from the 17th century and escaped using a speedboat. No arrests have been made. The church is the burial site for some of the country's kings and queens. There is increased security since that attack. According to a new study, 8 in 10 Americans attend religious services to become closer to God. But reasons for not going to church are more complicated. Pew Research Center finds 37% practice their faith in other ways. 28%, they're not believers. 23% haven't found a church or house of worship that they like. The study also finds Protestants are almost 2 times as likely as Catholics, that's 71% to 36%, to say valuable sermons are a very important reason for attending church. Temperatures in Rome reached nearly 100 degrees today. To cool things off, city officials sprung into action. They handed out 10,000 free water bottles to tourists, mostly at the Colosseum and Roman Forum. One visitor says he was especially grateful because vendors had doubled the price of water. Finally tonight, a woman in South Bend, Indiana, says the Holy Spirit guided her to make a quilt for President Trump. The South Bend Tribune reports 85-year-old Betty Alexander has been quilting for years, and she has made several for her children and grandchildren. Betty recently finished making a quilt for President Trump, who she says she loves. She is now looking for a way to get it to him. FedEx, UPS, the post office, I don't think that's what she means. All right, for all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night and God bless.